Please ask the host. Okay. Please ask the host to give you permission to record. So I accept that one there. Can you give me permission to record as well?
Yeah, yeah. But how to give you access for recording? I'm not sure about that.
If it's overly complicated, then
I can share you the recording, which I.
okay, yeah, that should be fine then.
All right.
Cool. So I want to use for my demo here, not the OpenFido app service, although that could also be useful. I want to use the client service. Well, I'll use that for a later part. First, all right. Let me share screen here. Desktop 2. Cool. All right. Hi, everyone. For people watching this recording, my name is Duncan Ragsdale. I'm software engineer over at the Slack Gizmo team, not Slack with a K. Slack is in the Stanford National Accelerator Laboratory. So let's get into our fun little GitHub Actions tutorial here. It's also going to kind of be meshed together with a general GitHub tutorial to kind of help with building workflows, and primarily to get, consistent development, testing, and other kinds of systems. So first, I'm going to start off on a little bit of a low end here, and if you guys have questions at any time, please feel free to interrupt me as we go along. So that way I can try and make sure we're all on track, nobody's confused or lost on anything. So the first thing I'd like to come up with is that when we're working on GitHub, we're going to want to make sure that we get everyone who's on the team added in. So I know I've sent invites out. I don't know how many people have gotten or accepted them. But I would like to get people added on here. So let's first check into our settings. I need to sign in. Um, so I know I've sent a lot of collaborations in. I think we're just waiting on one. Cool. So everyone's already part of here. So you can all be able to get into the repository. Has everyone tested actually accessing the repository? Have you been able to sign in, get in, and work around the repository and see, like, say, in the settings page for the repository? Let's start with that.
Yeah, I was able to do that. I didn't go in very deep, but yeah, I was able to access few pages.
Cool. So if you all have the settings tab available on the repository, that means you've essentially been added in. Each of you has been given essentially admin. Let's see here. Let's update maintain to admins here. So if you've got admin, that means you'll have essentially all the access you could possibly want or need for here. And you'd have access to the settings tab on the top. And you're going to eventually need that as you delve further into the development of this application. And the admin's setting and this settings tab has a lot of very, very powerful functions. Maintainers should have limited access to settings as well. Long term, though, we're going to need you guys to have that access for at least the initial setup, because that will give you access to environments, which we'll need for security later, as well as deploy keys if necessary. So that's the first thing, is just to make sure everyone's involved, is set up, and on the repository. Now, when you get into a repository, figuring out your workflows is going to be a very important step for your team. So in repositories, you have these things called branches. The base branch that comes on every repository is main. When you're trying to do work off a repository, there's two different ways you can do that. First would be either from forking the repository here. And so if you create a fork, you can create like a personal version of it. So this would be me, Thistleman's PV Validation Hub, which will give you a copy of the repository. You can select to take just the main branch or additional stuff. That is generally not the most common way to work on things unless you intend to diverge vastly from what the main project actually is. Um, but it is a way that you can kind of separate off work. The more common way is to utilize, oh, I just X'd out, didn't I? Habits. The more common way is to work with branches. And so right now we've got our one default branch of main here. And so when we take our PV validation hub, there's this nice little code tab here. So we can use this to open up a local, to clone it down to our local machine to work, and we can make branches there. Another way to make branches is that you can just hit the new branch button here. This is probably the least common way people make branches, but you can essentially use it like so. Source off of main, create a branch called test is what I'm going to use here. And boom, now there's a new branch that exists. And work that gets done on test is not automatically reflected into, say, the main. However, when I go over into the validation hub, I can now select test from my drop down, and we can see, I mean, currently it has the exact same stuff as main, so there's no changes. But if I wanted to add in a file, I could simply, let's just do add file, create new file. This is a file. And now commit directly to the test branch, create new file, call it yes, yes. And this handy guy is grayed out here. I can create a new branch and do a pull request. Why isn't it? Did I do a setting to prevent this? Maybe I did a setting. Oh, I didn't name my file. Duh. So I create a new file called test, called a file with the basic commits onto it. And now we can see that that test file is here. Compare it back to main. Main does not have that test file. So branches are going to be a very important way you're going to be able to work independently and not really conflict over each other as much, depending on what areas you're working in. Now, what you do and what you'll need to be doing later on, it's going to be better to use VS Code to, I like to use VS Code personally for working on this. And so let me get into a little bit more of the advanced part there. Is this making sense for everyone so far, or am I moving too fast? Y'all familiar with this? Could I like pass over some of this, or should I just keep going with the initial GitHub tutorial before hitting the workflows?
I think I'm good with that. Pretty familiar with GitHub.
Cool. Everyone else is pretty familiar, or would you? Okay, cool. So if we're already good on most of the general part there, then let's get to the workflows part. So I've got a couple example workflows I put together here for GitHub Actions. Each of these contains some of the basic things that you'll need in a workflow. And so I'm going to show what my examples I have as filler here, and then I can show what an actual one that I use, as well as some test runs on it to give a feel for GitHub Actions. So one of the first things that comes in would be the names that you're using for your workflows. These kind of get represented once you actually run the workflow, so you can differentiate between which elements are running and for what. The next thing, and this one's pretty important here, is the rules that you're going to use for when that workflow runs. So this workflow specifically runs on a push to the main branch. There's a lot of information in the developer docs for things that you can set for this, and there's a lot of information that should be readily available and is a pain to find. But there are a lot of different rules that you can use. So one of the ones that I use for, say, OpenFido client, if I want to deploy to staging, that's not the one. For testing build. On push branches ignore, I tell it to ignore the master branch. So this is a test that will run for any time I'm trying to do some development for that. There's other varieties. You could just say on push, and you'd have push in, say, brackets. That way on every push, you could have a workflow run. There's a variety of different rules you can use to run your tests or to run whatever you're trying to run. Because essentially what happens is that it's going to then create a runner once the condition is met to use that workflow. And so that's where we're going to get into for our jobs. And so the jobs are each of these individual set of tasks that you're trying to do. Where you first will set up your environment. So for this one, I use as an example, I can run this on Windows latest. Everyone knows what Windows is. You can run it that way. Other ones I used an example too. There's Ubuntu latest, or you can do Mac OS latest. Generally, I run everything off of Ubuntu because Linux is a pretty good universal system for handling a lot of technical coding elements. So most server infrastructure runs off of some form of Linux, whether it's Ubuntu or Debian. It's a very easy dev environment, very configurable. It tends to be pretty positive that way. Mac OS, we're probably not going to be using Mac OS or Windows for the most part, and I would just recommend sticking with Ubuntu. It will make your life easier in the long run. Then the next element that we would look at would be environments. Environments aren't necessarily required to have a workflow, but we will be needing those when we start creating development and production workflows. And so what the environments do, and here I'm going to utilize an example off of OpenFido client, is that environments, you can set up your secrets. Secrets are going to be something you're going to need to manage and take care of. And if you have an environment, they can't really be seen by those who are outside. And so if I go into staging, I'm not worried because then secrets are still hidden even within here. Because while I'm the one who set these secrets, I know what they are. If I click update, I can't read any of them. But you can set up each of these different secrets with a name and an ID that can be used. And so that, when you have your environment set, allows you to essentially call this variable in your workflow and use it for when you need to connect to, say, AWS to deploy an element, if you need to connect to somewhere else to pull something. And the way that looks, if I go back to my workflows here, is essentially you're going to have the $. Wait, no, that's not the one. Where is one where I'm calling it? AWS credentials, yeah. So you'd have the $, you get your two braces, and you'd call secrets dot, and then you put in your secret name. And that's how you'd be able to call things off of your environment. So this is running off of the staging environment. It's using my staging environment value. And so when you start building out elements to use to connect with AWS, you're going to want to start utilizing that more. And you can have additional rules with those environments as well. So that covers environments. So now this is where things actually start running in a runner. So we've got different steps. Each of these steps you're going to want to generally clearly label so you know what you're doing. And there's a few different things that you have. So this checkout repository, this utilizes an action off of the marketplace. I would generally recommend that when you're using actions, in each of these are called an action specifically in GitHub Actions. You can get them off of the marketplace. There's some core ones that are also part of the system. And then there are actions that you can use that somebody threw up on some repository. And if it's not a verified action in the marketplace, at that point, I wouldn't really want to trust it. And so this one will just check out the repository that's calling it. So here, this would literally be the first step you'd use essentially in every set of steps in a workflow, the first action. Then if I wanted to set up Python, there's an action to do so. And then we can get to the point where we can actually start passing out commands once you've got all of your setup that you do in the start. So when you have the run command here, that is going to essentially treat it like you're in a terminal inside their runner. And it runs it like kind of like a shell script, if you will. And so in this current format, this is going to be passing off just this single line of command, sudo pip install twine. So I can use pip, which would be installed with Python, to install the package. If you use the bar with the run, then you can pass multiple commands off of that single step. However, depending on what you're trying to do, I would try and keep it within a certain category. So if I've got a category for, where is one that I'm using multiple? I don't think I've got it off of this guy. So that's like if you just have multiple commands, like you want to do a conda build or something, then essentially you'd have like, okay, I'm building the environment, and then you have each of the steps you use. That's kind of how I do it to try and maintain some clarity. And so in addition to each of these elements of the steps, there are other things that you could set, other configurations, some defaults if you want to have a specific kind of way you want your bash to be set up. But that's a quick, low and dirty way of working with some workflows there. And so if we want to look at how they run in action, so let's see here. So let's go to when I last ran my test build here on OpenFido about 4 months ago. And so when you have your action run, yeah, I know the logs have expired. I should be able to just rerun the job. No, it's not going to let me rerun jobs here. That's annoying. Is it because it's too old? Cool, I'll use PV Insight as an example. That one I can rerun a job on. Let's see here. No, it's Solar Data Tools. There we go. This one also has some fun stuff I can show you guys. So let me go to here where I've got my tests running. So here, was this one too old too? Let's go to here, passing 18 days ago. So I can rerun jobs. So when you've got multiple jobs, oh, this one will have dependencies. That'll be a cool thing to show you guys. I'll show you after I do our first run here. So when I rerun the job, it'll find a runner. So it's looking for an Ubuntu latest, waiting for the runner to pick up the job. And so when you got the little orange dot, that's just because it's waiting to find a runner. And so now it's starting to run. And so you can see that when it runs, it's starting to go through all of the code that you set up to do all the processing. And here's each of our different steps that we've got. So I'm going to now show you essentially what this kind of workflow looks like, because this one has a nice variety of fun other elements. So tests I like to run. This is the one I talked about where you're just having it run on push. That anytime anybody tries to update anything on one of their branches, you can just have all of your tests run every time. It makes your life really easy to see that if any code you're pushing is working as intended after it pushes. And so here, again, I've got more of my secrets that I use. Now, when I'm trying to make sure I use Python, I do recommend trying to specify the Python version. I've noticed a lot of times with the runners, if the Python version is going to be something that matters to your build, to use the variable for Python location bin Python 3, because it keeps defaulting to the system Python, not the version that gets installed. So I'd like to be very particular when I list out my Python version. Other fun things that you can do. So if you want to have a dependency set, so before you try and run a build, you can set a needs step for each of, or a needs element in each of the jobs, right? So the job to build PyPy needs run tests to complete. Run tests is this first job that I built here. And so once this job runs, if all the tests pass, then I know it's like, okay, cool. So if the tests are passing, then it's worth spending the time to try and do a PyPy build. Granted, this isn't going to do a PyPy deployment. I'm just testing to make sure the build works. And so now you can see where I used Twine as my example. I use some of these as a base. And so then I can run through and do the rest of this elements after tests have passed and moved on. There are a variety of other factors that you can also set that can get a lot more complicated depending on what you're using. If you like to use Conda, you've got jobs that you can set up mini Conda, you can specify versions, you can specify whether or not it should all be operating within an environment or if it should just automatically start on your base. And that's a quick low and dirty into some general GitHub actions there. And we can see that this guy is still running through tests, but once that's done, it'll hit, yeah, it's finishing up right there. This one has an odd thing where you also want to have consistency with your tests. This is something that I'm still trying, that I need to get some time to sort out here. But your tests should generate the same results every time they run. Sometimes, if they generate different results, there's an inconsistent part in your code, which is what happens here. One reason I didn't want to necessarily use this example because it's not consistent like some of the other stuff I've got. So if you've got a piece of code that'll generate a different result depending on when it was written, that's something that you're going to want to take care of. But life is never simple, and those are problems that you're going to find generally once it's painful to deal with them. So that's that. Any questions so far on workflows with GitHub Actions? Cool. So now I want to get into covering some more elements with some of the more advanced elements with some of the workflows. So one of the things that you're going to probably find yourselves having to do with continuous integration and continuous deployment is doing those deployment elements. And so there's probably going to be a mix. Python is going to likely be the majority for our back end. If you can build the front end in Python, that would be a very interesting thing to observe. But that would likely be our one React guy is likely going to be our front end specialist. But that's just what I'm assuming. I'll figure it. I'll see what you guys are doing when you let me know. So whether you want to build it in JavaScript or if you want to build the front end in Python, those all options that you guys can decide. I am a front end engineer myself that's been working on all kinds of other additional tasks and learning along the way. So React is my specialty, but I've got a little bit of Python, a little bit of C, a little bit of DevOps, a lot of shell scripting that I never expected, but I eventually figured out. And so when you do a deployment to AWS, there's quite a few different other elements that you're going to wind up using. So one of them that's going to be core is having a set of credentials that you're going to be utilizing. I'm going to need to get everyone their own set of AWS credentials when it gets time to work on that. And those credentials are going to be essentially what will send each of those elements out. So this part for the client, it tends to actually not be that complicated. Essentially, I can set up and build everything for my node environment here. And then once I have that build, which would be I would be using my npm run build to get it set up. I would then store it into a temporary workspace, and then I can use that workspace to upload that artifact. And so essentially, then I take that build of our npm of our front end client. I can take that build and I uploaded it over to our AWS S3 environment, and then utilizing AWS CloudFront, it distributes it and sets it up for users to be able to access. And so if I want to go to say like Open Fido, should have a web page I can go to for it. App.openfido.org. To be this one or this one? I think it's this one. Nope, that's the wrong one. Simple sign in, boom. And so this is all the front end plus back end that can be assembled, but the front end essentially can be automatically deployed. And so the AWS side, that's going to be a whole other conversation if we need to cover that when time comes to cover it. But that was essentially what a somewhat more advanced usage of actions can be used to do. And so you can build your elements here and push them out to AWS to have live updates for each individual containers. Infrastructure as code would be useful to do a mass, like if you need to take the entire thing and spin it up all at once, that's when you'd start looking at things like Terraform or Pulumi or some of those other elements. So any other questions so far? Any thoughts, any usages, use cases you might want to know about?
Sorry, I maybe miss out something. I just want to know the steps. There's a usage action slash. Where can I
Yes.
find these actions?
So actions. So let's see. GitHub actions. Available actions. Let's see here. So there's the marketplace, which can give a list of things you can search for actions to do stuff. That can download, build an artifact, upload artifacts, set up a variety of environments. There's a lot of different actions available out on the marketplace. Google can also generally be your friend in finding a lot of things. So like if you want to use a GitHub actions install Python, for example, you can just do, oh, there's an action setup Python here. And so this is one that, and a lot of times they'll have a repository for some of them, and they'll have a lot of steps for it. So this is one that I'm using. So I'm using actions setup Python. They've got up to version 4 out now. I've been using version 3. And so a lot of times they'll have a set of instructionals for some of these packages that are out there. And they'll have repositories for them. I would just recommend, like, if you're finding an odd repository of an action to do something that's not quite right there in the marketplace, give it some thought and a review before maybe implementing its use. But for the most part, they tend to work out pretty well.
So if we need to add some actions in our workflow, we just go to search that and in a GitHub marketplace and then add to YAML, right?
Yeah, you can find it and you can just add it simply. You can just tag in the name for the step, uses actions, and you'd have the action that you're using. So all of them will start with an action slash. So these ones are for like checking out the repository, setting up Python. Somewhere I've got setup node is another good one, and AWS, they've got their own full set of actions, and so these ones are a little bit different. This would be an AWS actions because AWS is a big name company and they don't want to have their stuff get potentially mixed with anyone else's. So any AWS actions, you're going to want to make sure they're in AWS actions and it's not some third party tossing some weird thing on there. And they have configure AWS credentials at V1. But for the most part, most actions will be action slash. Actions download artifact is one that you can use. And so you don't necessarily need to have the actions be used immediately to set up something. You can call them when you need them to do their whatever you're using them for.
I see. Thank you. Another question is about, could you elaborate more about the secrecy or secret?
Yes, secrets,
I'm
actually.
not very familiar with that.
So secrets, when we go into our settings, secrets is something that you set up in each of your environments, right? And so I've created a staging and a production environment. So secrets I find tied very well into an environment, and you can use them whether an environment can be used for secrets or without secrets. They're not necessary to be part of it. In an environment, you can set a few different rules. You can set required reviewers to work in an environment. So coworker Jimmy here, I could add him as a required reviewer. You can set people so that if something's going to be done in a certain area, it will require someone to review it for it to be done. I use this in some other areas, but considering for OpenFido, there's literally like 3 of us who have access to it. It's kind of unnecessary. Then we'll hit deployment branches. You can specify what branches the environment would even be allowed to run on. So somebody can't just cheese your environment to try and get the secrets out of it. You would have to require like, oh, an improved merge into master branch, and then this environment can be used in a workflow to run. So there are different ways of setting up levels of security there. And the secrets themselves are here in the environment. They're an environment secret. And so when this environment is used in a runner, and this environment runs, this secret can then be accessed. So these protection rules here can keep somebody from nefariously trying to run this environment and scraping your secrets, because then before their code in that runner could even run, it's going to be like, hey, this doesn't match this rule, or this person hasn't reviewed it, so we're not even going to let it run at that point. It has to be approved to even run. So those are very useful protection methods to keep nefarious people. It applies most in open source areas if you've got collaborators from the outside trying to submit code and you got to review it before it goes in. But it's always good practice to try and keep some level of protection rules available, so that way people can't just come in and steal your secrets. Like the main one I like using, if it's going to the master branch or main branch, both of those, master is the old school way, main's the new way they call it. Master branch, I've got some branch protection rules that branch has to have a review before anything gets pushed to it. So nobody can sneak in and steal my information for these secrets. Now, when you add the secret, it's simple. You can just toss in your secret name, delete me, and its value of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, but it's a secret. Don't tell anyone. So when I add that secret, I can now reference the delete me variable utilizing the I had that passing, and now I really need to get with Bennett and find that bug, because it's on some test that they do there, and I don't know what test it is, because I never made that test. Maintaining stuff is going to be fun in your futures. Jumping into stuff and figuring out what's happening and what somebody else did a long time ago. And so the secrets can just be referenced again using you use the $, the double braces, and secrets dot secret name. So with the secret that I call delete me, I can reference that with secrets dot delete underscore me, and it has to match the case perfectly. So since I used all caps for delete me, I'd have to reference it with all caps here, and that will provide the value 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 that I put in. Now, I don't intend to leave this around, but if I try and go back here and update this, you note that it doesn't show the old secret value. That means that whatever secret's here, even if people come after you, nobody's going to be able to see it. So generally, like if you're using an AWS credential or something like that you don't want other people to access, it keeps it pretty safe that way, and it can still be referenced for your environments. But it also means that you don't want the only version of your password to be saved onto here, because then like say your credential that you made, if you need to use that credential again or update it, I mean, updating, you just replace the value, but if you need to use it again and you only saved it on here and don't have a copy, a hard local copy, then that's its own challenge. And another reason we do want to use secrets this way is you never want to hard code any secrets. So if you upload your AWS credentials into GitHub repository, somebody can scrape those off of any public-facing repository, and this is a public-facing repository, and then they can try and use that access to do nefarious things. If that does happen, that credential would need to be deleted immediately and invalidated off of AWS, and that's a pain, and you don't want to deal with it, and I don't want to deal with it. So let's try and make sure that at the very least, don't hard code any secrets inside your programs, but we can instead utilize systems to reference them. There's a way to manage secrets as well on AWS itself for internal stuff that we'll need to track and manage. That's an entirely separate discussion and an entirely separate problem than handling it here on GitHub Actions. Let's just get rid of delete me. I don't want to have somebody come back here and be like, hey, what's this delete me secret? I don't think anybody will come back and see that for a very long time, but you know, I like to be kind to those who come after me. Cool.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. Did that answer your questions on secrets? Hopefully.
Yes, it's very clear now.
Cool. All right. Glad to hear that. All right. Any additional questions on anything we've covered so far? Anything else you might want to see?
Can we run curl commands on the YAML file?
Wait, so say again?
Can we run any bash commands or curl commands on the YAML file?
Yes. So the YAML file, essentially, you'd have to use the correct syntax. Finally cleared that. That's how you can see inconsistent code. Fails and passes. So the YAML file, when you've got your command here, so I'll name this runs multiple commands. I then use the run command here, and at this point, you can start putting in bash commands. So echo bash command, echo line 1, then that means that this will echo that line there. And then when do echo line 2, it'll say line 2, echo it out. If you want to use other bash commands, if you want to use sed to like manipulate some kind of text file, you can do so. If you want to use Python to do an install of something, you know, that's sudo pip install twine, telling it to have pip install twine. All
then
those commands.
If we run some command with the secret, will that secret get replaced?
So if you run a command with the secret, as long as you reference it with this format, then it will replace the value there. Yes. So
will not
like
that
right
not be
here.
a problem? Or
so I mean, it's intent. That's how it's intended to be used. The point of the secret. So if you're trying to, so like right here, AWS S3 sync temp workspace build S3 secrets.stage S3 URL. So I need that secret to be able to pass the correct value to S3. However, if you're concerned about the logs showing this value, I do have some additional good news for you. Any secrets that you're referencing in this environment from S3, when it has the secrets value here that's being referenced, GitHub has set it so that way in the logs, this value will be encoded and hidden. So you'll see like star instead of the actual value that's being referenced here. So I believe for not validation hub, would it be Conda? Did I use any of my secrets here? Let me see. Let's open this up. Solar data tools, build. This should be referencing secrets.pypy password when I pushed a pypy. So let's look at that one. Build pypy. And so when I've got the set of commands, this is the right one, right? No, that's not the actions I want. That's tests I want from deploy. Here we go. So deploying to pypy, when I pull this up, I'm not worried about you seeing my information because that secret you got *** replaced wherever that secret is used. So when I see that, I know it's referencing that environment variable. By the fact that it's successfully deployed properly, I know that the variable is correct. So one thing that you can do is that when you set up a secret, you can try doing some tests to make sure that your secret's good. And once you know the secret's good, if things fail in the future, it generally can help you figure out where the actual bug in the code is.
Okay, got it.
There's a reason I also have a lot of confidence showing you guys stuff I'm actively working on, because I know you're not going to see anything that you don't need to see. It's a lot of fun working with GitHub Actions here. Oh yeah, and actually there's one other cool thing I've got set up with Solar Data Tools here. I'm going to show you on the build. This one is one that was a real pain to find. And so if you want to have something that runs specifically when you want to release a new version, you can use the on release types published set here. This one took me forever to actually find. And this means that essentially when you go to your repository, you've got a releases tab here. And you can use releases to create a new tagged release. You can draft it up, tag it, push it, and once it gets that new release done, then that workflow will run there. There are instances where that can be extremely useful. So say you get some updates pushed to the main branch, and then you want that to push first to staging and see if everything works in your staging environment. And if it does, then you can be like, all right, we know staging is good. We didn't mess anything up. Then you can create a new release, and then that can start the workflow that runs everything for your production environment. So there's ways of being able to essentially control flow. So that way your production, you can always be like, hey, production's always safe. We get to test everything in our staging environment, make sure it works before we ever push to production. So that's another handy little trick right there. And Solar Data Tools is a public repository, so if you do want to re-see that, or if you forget it and you just ask me, I can get that to you guys without any issue. This is I really like this little one here. So yeah, so that's a couple handy things there. You can also tell I'm a programmer because talking a lot is challenging. And I have so many tabs. If you guys have lots of tabs, don't feel bad about it. You'll get used to it. Tabs for life. Let's cool. Any other questions? Anything else?
I have a really general question, Duncan.
Cool.
The repository which you shared with us, which was PV Insights Validation Hub, that repository is only for our team, right?
Yes, that is correct. So PV Validation Hub is just going to be for you guys. So I know there's other CMU teams. They've got their own repositories and areas they're working on. This one is just going to be you guys. And so the only other people that might have anything that they would do on it would, if not me, possibly Bennett, maybe Mayank. Mayank has his hands full on a lot of different teams and stuff, so the odds of him personally doing anything here are quite unlikely. But if he wanted to, he would have full rates too.
So all the branches as a team only will be creating.
Yeah, so the branches would pretty much be all done by you guys, other than the test branch here, which I can now promptly delete. My main branch isn't protected. So yeah, you're going to want to set some protections for the environment. So you can go through to protection. That shows up here in branches. Great question. You led me on to something else I needed to cover. Branch protection. I mentioned it slightly earlier, but so this one will essentially look for a branch name pattern. So if we want main, we can put in main. If you want to have a general pattern, you can use some form of a general expression. There are some general expressions that can be used in name patterns. You can look them up. So if you want to have like main dash star that kind of thing. That will be like any name that has a main dash and then whatever. It has to be some form of main. You can have a rule for that. And so you can come up with patterns to look. So if you've got just the text main, it's going to look for things that match main precisely. And you can set up protections here. So if you want to, you can set a pull request requirement before merging. So there has to be that pull request. And pull requests, you can then set rules that so let's see here. So you don't want to allow for full you don't want to allow these generally for like main. You don't want people to do a force push there unless something's really gone wrong. Then you can adjust settings there. You can require deployments to succeed before merging. And so if you've got a combination of requiring deployments to succeed and requiring a pull request, you can then have an environment that only runs on that pull request that's been submitted, and you can use protections that way. There's other creative ways to use it. And so these are generally good things to think about and utilize on certain branches to ensure certain coding standards have been met along the way, and that you're not just getting something weird shoved onto your main branch or other protected branches. Cool.
Thanks for sharing it.
Yeah, no problem. Tags, these often get used in setting versions for things. If you guys want to start using tags, that's something we can start worrying about once we have actually something to release. So it's not a big worry at the moment. We already covered actions. If you don't want to use GitHub Actions, webhooks is something you're going to have to figure out and work with. I don't know webhooks all too well, but I wouldn't recommend them. But if you want to figure them out, that's your choice. Other things that you can do would be like utilizing deploy keys. So if you've got repositories that have interdependencies on each other, and you want to keep something private and it can be used elsewhere, you could utilize a deploy key for that. They can get a little convoluted utilizing them. So unless we actually need it, then we can cover something in that case. Otherwise, I'd recommend not dealing with that just yet. And I suppose the repos in general, creating a wiki is something that that we're going to want to set up. So you can just build a wiki page that you can reference. So how we want to keep documentation, essentially there's two ways of using things. You can have the wiki page for the repository specifically, and then you can also make the MD documents within the repository itself. And so if you've got like a readme.md and then you go into say here on the workflows, we note that we've got nothing here. But if I create a file and call it, let's just do another readme.md. Here is some stuff on workflows. Then what this will do, and committing to the main branch is generally not recommended, but now that there's that readme here, we now have a handy little blurb in this workflow section that wasn't there before. And so you can include some documentation that way. So if you want to have the readme docs and the MD docs be like, say, a form of user documentation, and then have the wiki be for developers, or vice versa, just make sure that whatever you choose to do, you're consistent with it. You can work that way. So like if I go to just up to .github, now I no longer have that readme because that's in the workflow specific area. So there's a lot of different ways you can manage stuff on here. Now I know we haven't gotten into pull requests, but when you have your branches that you're using and you want to pull them up into main, you would generally want to make that pull request to send your updates over. As that will then you can trigger specific things that way. It gives it time to review the code. And when you have that pull request into main, it will also do that comparison of your branch versus the main branch, and it'll let you know if it can be automatically merged or not. But before ever doing a pull request, I still always would recommend that you pull the latest updates that somebody else may have merged into main, so that way you can address any conflicts before you submit your pull request, and you can keep everything running smooth. But those are points of workflows that you're going to need to sort out amongst yourselves within your team. Cool. All right. Any final questions here as we're coming up on 5? Questions, comments, concerns, any heartburn? Y'all got a warm and fuzzy on GitHub Actions now and how that's gonna all roll?
No questions from me. Any question, guys?
All right. And then shortly I'm going to add, so have you all had a chance to read the white paper that's listed for our documentation?
Yes.
Cool. I will be adding in, so I've got the technical requirements here. I'm going to be essentially adding this onto our documentation here within the next 5 to 10 minutes. I was going to upload it a little sooner. I just had to take care of a quick emergency. So I'll have the requirements up for you guys here shortly as well for the technical requirements. Now keep in mind, these aren't like exhaustive lists of everything that needs to be done, but it should help you for the technical side of like, hey, at a minimum, here's some of the other absolute necessities that we've got to be concerned about. But I know, like, if you guys have other things that you need to know, feel free to request additional information from us to help build the it is getting late. My voice is going out.
Yeah, we are almost on
Yeah.
time. Just have 5 more
So-
minutes left. So thanks for creating this requirement document. We'll go through it, and maybe on Friday we'll be able to have more questions on that.
Cool. So all right. So I'll get this onto our documentation here in the next few minutes.
Mhm. Thanks for the session, Duncan. You can take rest now.
Yes, I can save what's left of my vocal cords. I never talk this much.
Yeah, that was a lot of stuff. All right. Thank you.